The United States is at war with Iran, the Middle East is on fire, and now Christians are being forced to answer a question most of them have never seriously thought about. Can you claim to follow Jesus Christ and still support this war? Some Protestants and political Christians are already acting like the answer is simple. Defend America, crush evil, hit back harder. But the Catholic Church is throwing a wrench into that entire mindset, because according to Catholic teaching, not every war is just, not every strike is moral, and not every patriotic argument survives the gospel. In fact, if this war fails the Church's just war test, then Catholics do not get to support it, just because they are angry, afraid, or politically loyal. And that is where this gets explosive. Because this is not just about Iran, America, or foreign policy anymore. This is about whether Christians are following Christ, or just dressing up revenge in religious language.
Can Christians support military action against Iran and still be faithful to Jesus? Well, that's a question a lot of believers are asking right now as the conflict in the Middle East escalates. But here's the key. Christianity has never taught absolute pacifism. The Bible recognizes that governments have a God-given responsibility to restrain evil and to protect innocent people. In Christian ethics, that's called just war thinking. War is tragic. It always means suffering. It's a result of sin. But when a regime threatens massive violence or pursues weapons that devastate entire populations, stopping that threat can actually be a way of protecting human life. So Christians can and should pray for peace, innocent civilians, and pray for leaders to act wisely. But supporting defensive action against evil is not incompatible with Christian values. The goal isn't always war. The goal should always be justice, protection of life, and ultimately peace.
Some Protestants will immediately attack the Catholic position from both directions. On one side, some will accuse Catholics of being weak, passive, and unrealistic, arguing that the world is evil and force is necessary, period. On the other side, some will accuse Catholics of hypocrisy, claiming that if Jesus taught peace, forgiveness, and love of enemies, then no Christian can ever support war under any circumstances. So Catholics are attacked either way, too soft for one side, too compromised for the other. But the Catholic Church has never taught that war is automatically good, and it has never taught that all force is automatically evil. The Church's position is more morally demanding than both slogans, and that is exactly why so many people hate it.
This is something I have seen so many Catholics get wrong when they're trying to justify military action, because they usually jump to a quote that says those who legitimately hold authority also have the right to use arms to repel aggressors. No argument there, but you have to keep reading, because Catholic social teaching about war goes on to say all citizens and all governments are obliged to work for the avoidance of war. And you might think, oh, well, the answer is we need to stockpile more weapons. The Church goes, no. The accumulation of arms, that is over-armament, multiplies reasons for conflict and increases dangers of escalation. Injustice, excessive economic or social inequalities constantly threaten peace and cause wars. And it concludes by saying, because of the evils and injustices that all war brings with it, we, us, Catholics, must do everything reasonably possible to avoid it. Now let's be clear, Catholic doctrine is not a pacifist doctrine, but it foundationally teaches that military action is only permitted when, quote, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical and ineffective. Military action is a last resort to Catholics.
The starting point for Catholics is not war solves problems. The starting point is peace. Always peace. Jesus did not preach bloodlust. He did not glorify conquest. He did not teach his disciples to become addicts of violence. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God," in Matthew 5:9. That is not symbolic fluff. That is Christian discipleship. Jesus also says in Matthew 26:52, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Again, that is not the language of a faith that worships war. And when Christ is hanging on the cross, he does not call down legions to destroy his enemies. He prays, "Father, forgive them," in Luke 23:34. The Catholic Church sees all of this clearly. Peace is not optional in Christianity. It is at the center of the gospel.
Today, the whole of humanity afflicted by violence and conflict is crying out for reconciliation. The desire for full communion among all believers in Jesus Christ is always accompanied by the search for fraternity among all human beings. Furthermore, we must strongly reject the use of religion for justifying war, violence, or any form of fundamentalism or fanaticism. Instead, the paths to follow are those of fraternal encounter, dialogue, and cooperation.
But here is where lazy critics get exposed. The Catholic Church does not confuse love of peace with denial of evil. That is the childish mistake. The world is fallen. Nations are threatened. Innocent people are attacked. Terror regimes exist. Governments have real duties to protect their citizens. And Scripture does not teach that civil authority has no right to restrain evil. Romans 13:4 says that governing authority does not bear the sword in vain, but is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. That verse matters. It means that force, in principle, is not automatically immoral. Governments are not called to sit back and let slaughter happen. Defense can be morally legitimate. The issue is not whether force can ever be used. The issue is whether it is being used justly.
Dall'Iran e da tutto il Medio Oriente continuano a giungere notizie che destano profonda costernazione. Agli episodi di violenza e devastazione e al diffuso clima di odio e paura si aggiunge il timore che il conflitto si allarghi e altri paesi della regione, tra cui il caro Libano, possano sprofondare nuovamente nell'instabilità. Eleviamo la nostra umile preghiera al Signore perché cessi il fragore delle bombe, tacciano le armi e si apra uno spazio di dialogo nel quale si possa sentire la voce dei popoli.
And that is exactly where Catholic just war teaching comes in. The Church does not say, war is fine if you feel threatened. The Church does not say, if your nation is angry, unleash hell. The Church does not say, if you can destroy your enemy, you should. Catholic teaching puts war in a moral straitjacket. It says military force can only be justified under strict conditions, and all of them must be met. Not some of them. Not most of them. All of them. That alone should tell you the Church begins from resistance to war, not eagerness for it. The Catechism and the just war tradition lay out the essential framework. There must be grave and certain damage inflicted by the aggressor. All other means must have been shown ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. Catholic teachers and bishops have also emphasised legitimate authority, right intention, just cause, last resort, and proportionality. These are not loopholes to bless any war a government wants. They are barriers meant to prevent exactly the kind of reckless bloodshed people too often baptise with patriotic language. And that is why recent Catholic voices have spoken so strongly about the US war with Iran. Cardinal McElroy argued that this war fails the just war test in major ways. He pointed to the lack of a clear, imminent, objectively verifiable attack by Iran on the United States. He pointed to the danger of preventive war, which Catholic teaching has long regarded as morally dangerous because it destroys all real limits on war. Once, maybe someday, becomes enough justification to bomb another nation, then every government on earth can invent a future threat and call it self-defense. That is not moral clarity. That is moral collapse. He also pointed to the problem of intention. If the goals of war are unclear, shifting, and politically convenient, then the war cannot satisfy the criterion of right intention. Is the goal regime change, deterrence, total surrender, destruction of military capability, democratic reconstruction, punishment, revenge? If a nation cannot clearly state what moral end it seeks, then it is not engaged in disciplined justice. It is stumbling into destruction. And Catholics should be the first to say that confusion and bloodshed are not enough to make a war righteous. Then there is proportionality, and this is where many in war supporters reveal that they are not thinking morally at all. They are thinking emotionally. They see evil and want it crushed. Fine, evil should be resisted, but the Church asks a harder question. What will this war unleash? How many civilians will die? How many children? How many neighbouring nations will be dragged in? How many Christian communities already hanging by a thread will be shattered? How much instability will spread through Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, the Gulf and beyond? How much human suffering will come from oil shocks, refugee flows, retaliatory strikes, proxy attacks, and endless escalation? Catholic teaching refuses to let people treat these consequences like background noise. If the cure is more destructive than the disease, then the war is not morally justified. That is why the Catholic lens on the US-Iran war is not rah-rah America, and it is not naive pacifist fantasy either. It is moral realism under the lordship of Jesus Christ. It acknowledges evil. It acknowledges duty. It acknowledges the right of legitimate defense. But it also says something many modern people cannot tolerate. Not everything a nation can do is something a nation may do. Military power is not moral proof. Missiles are not arguments. Bombs do not create righteousness. A nation can be strong and still be wrong. Some Christians will object at this point and say, but Iran is ruled by a brutal regime. Isn't removing evil rulers a good thing? Maybe that sounds satisfying, but Catholic teaching still asks whether the war itself is just. Evil regimes do not give governments blank moral checks. If that logic were enough, then nearly every powerful country on earth could constantly invade weaker nations under the banner of liberation. The Church has seen enough history to know that noble language often hides ambition, confusion, pride, and catastrophe. That is why just war doctrine is so strict. It is meant to restrain governments before they intoxicate themselves on moral self-righteousness. And Catholics also have to remember the forgotten victims in all this. Middle Eastern Christians are always among the first to bleed and the last to be remembered. Churches are damaged, priests are killed. Ancient communities shrink again, families flee again. Entire Christian populations that survived persecution, dictatorship, jihad, civil war, and regional instability find themselves trapped once more in a conflict they did not start and cannot control. If Catholics talk about war without talking about these communities, then they are not thinking like Catholics. They are thinking like ideologues. So what should Catholics do? First, reject the lie that war is exciting. It is not. It is mutilation, grief, widows, funerals, fear, propaganda, trauma, and moral corrosion. Pope John Paul II called war a defeat for humanity. Pope Francis said every war leaves the world worse than it was before. That should sober every Catholic who is tempted to cheer from a distance. Second, pray for peace, seriously and specifically. Not as a cliché. Pray for de-escalation. Pray for diplomats to succeed. Pray for soldiers, civilians, and persecuted Christians. Pray for leaders to abandon pride. Pray for those trapped in fear. Third, Catholics should speak morally, not tribally. Do not let your politics decide your conscience. Let Christ and his Church do that. If the war fails the Church's moral test, then Catholics should say so, even if it offends nationalists. And if a legitimate defence were ever truly necessary, Catholics should say that too, even if it offends absolutist pacifists. The point is fidelity, not applause. And that brings us to the real debate. Protestants and other Christians will keep throwing slogans around. Some will shout, "A Christian can never support war." Others will bark, "A Christian must support his nation, period." The Catholic Church says both of those shortcuts are morally lazy. Christ calls his followers to be peacemakers, yes. Governments may bear the sword under limited conditions, yes. But war must pass a severe moral test, and at this moment many Catholic leaders are warning that the US war with Iran does not pass that test. So should Catholics support this war? Based on the just war principles the Church has taught for generations, the answer is not emotional, partisan, or bloodthirsty. The answer is moral. And if the criteria are not met, Catholics do not get to baptize the conflict just because their country is involved. The Catholic answer is harder than that, more honest than that, more biblical than that. Catholics are called to resist evil, defend the innocent, pray for peace, and refuse to confuse national power with moral legitimacy. That is the line, and that is exactly why this issue should shake the conscience of every serious Christian.